his past, how he began ISKCON, how he enlivened the devotees to spread ISKCON all over the world. And every year, I find newer and more unbelievable things that Srila Prabhupada did. So this year, I found out so many wonderful things about Srila Prabhupada that I never knew before, that I just wanted to tell all of you about. Because normally we hear the history, what we know within ISKCON. But there are other things now. For instance, Prabhupada's, the way he spoke to his godbrothers in Bengali are being translated. And some of his godbrothers have shared their memories of Srila Prabhupada in the early days before he went to America. So these things that we never hear about, I just want to share these diamonds with all of you tonight. So the first most wonderful thing is, we heard this beautiful bhajan today, Jai Radhe, Jai Krishna, Jai Vrindavan. So Srila Prabhupada, he was here in his bed. Now this bed was not always here. This whole room was covered with white duddies, and there was just a little strip on the sides for the devotees to walk, because this is Prabhupada's darshan room. The bed was only brought here in October 1977 for Prabhupada to have his Antim Lila. So the devotees would come here to sit with Prabhupada in the evenings, just like this time. Prabhupada would have public darshan before the evening artik, and then arti time he would shoo everybody out of the room and send them to arti. So Prabhupada, during his Antim Lila, he was in his bed here, and one day his godbrothers got together and they came to see Srila Prabhupada to say farewell to him, because they knew that he would be going back to Krishna soon. And Prabhupada spoke to them very lovingly. First, he begged their forgiveness for any offenses that he might have committed. And the leader, this spokesperson amongst them was Bhakti Pramod Puri Maharaj. He said, "No, you didn't commit any offense to us. Possibly we committed offense to you, but let's forget all of that now." And then Prabhupada asked him, Puri Maharaj, his senior godbrother, he said, "I know that when our Srila Prabhupada, because the name Srila Prabhupada was used for Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, when he was about to enter into the spiritual world, leave his body, you wanted to sing for him, but you weren't able to." Another godbrother sang, Sridhar Maharaj. "So I'm asking you for one gift now." And Puri Maharaj said to him, "Yes, anything, you tell me what you want." He said, "My last wish was," Prabhupada said, "my last wish was that I wanted to go on Govardhan Parikrama, and I wanted to go on Brajmando Parikrama, but I'm not able to in this condition. So you please sing this song, and by this song I'll be able to do full Parikrama, just by hearing this song." So I never understood that about this beautiful bhajan, but now I realize that simply by singing this song, by meditating on all the names and all the places, we're actually doing full Parikrama of Braj, including Govardhan Parikrama. So Prabhupada was very happy when Bhakti Pramod Puri Maharaj sang this song. And then, after singing the song, Prabhupada said to him, "Now I would like to give you a gift." Now this was a big controversy amongst, not only within the Gaudiya Math, but within all the Sampradayas, that Srila Prabhupada, of course this was started by his spiritual master Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and where did they get this inspiration from? From Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu accepted those who were not born in Brahmin families to take prasadam from them, to live with them, to instruct them, and to allow them to do worship. In other words, he accepted them as Brahmins, although they were not by birth Brahmins. So even within the confines of our Gaudiya mission, there were objections because never before, within India, that's one thing. But pure mlecha yavanists such as ourselves, that Prabhupada picked up from the depths of the lowest forms of subhuman birth, he picked us up and he turned us into Brahmins through this alchemical process that Srila Sanatana Goswami describes, through this Diksha process. So Prabhupada said to Puri Maharaj, I want to give you a gift now. So when Puri Maharaj said, yes, whatever you want to give us, we'll happily accept. So then Prabhupada called one of his servants and whispered something to him. And the servant ran out, and he came back with a full plate of Mahaprasadam from the Krishna Balaram temple. Now, the Mahaprasadam here, who is it cooked by? It's cooked by, in those days, we didn't have any Indian devotees. Now everybody here in the whole room is Indian. I might be the only foreigner here, I think. So here's one more. Bibhishan, our demon devotee here. Proof that the most fallen are now in the spiritual world. So, but in those days it was only foreign devotees. They were doing the cooking, they were doing the worshipping, they were doing the serving, everything. So one of Prabhupada's disciples comes in with this full plate of Mahaprasadam from Krishna Balaram and offers it to Puri Maharaj. And not only Puri Maharaj, but everyone who he came with, all the other God brothers and the God brothers of the God brothers, they all took that Mahaprasadam together. And this was the love that because Prabhupada had accepted his disciples and given them the blessings and the adhikari to serve Krishna Balaram, Radhasham Sundar Gaur-Nitai, now his God brothers were accepting them also and taking prasadam from their hands. So this was the greatest gift for Srila Prabhupada when he saw that his God brothers accepted his disciples. So that was a beautiful pastime that I had never heard before. Anyone ever heard that before? No, wonderful. You had? Oh, you're lucky. So then I was going deeply into, because sometimes we hear little bits and pieces about a great devotee of Srila Nityananda Prabhu named Uraradatta Thakur. He lived in a place called Saptagram, which is near Hooghly, all in the Calcutta area. And previously Calcutta was just a beautiful country area, but then when the British entered into India and they wanted to make a capital, they chose the most beautiful place, which was Calcutta at that time. And they made that into their capital. They made beautiful buildings. It was right in the shelter of the Ganga coming from the sea. And the merchants, when they saw that the English now were making this into a big capital, the merchants, particularly from this area of Saptagram, they made up 50% of the population in Calcutta. The Suvarna Vaniks. So they came, and they were wealthy merchants, gold merchants, cloth merchants. All the 50% of the population in Calcutta were these Suvarna Vaniks. And Prabhupada goes into much detail, not in one place, but in many different conversations, and in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. He explains that of these Suvarna Vaniks, they're Vaishyas, but there are two families. And that is the Day family, which Prabhupada was born in, and the other is the Seal family. For instance, Prabhupada went to the Motilal Seal Free School. And the Seals and the Days, both of them were called Maliks. Malik, Roy, Chaudhary, Khan, these are all Muslim names that were awarded to merchants and other people who were not directly engaged in service with the Mohammedans, but were doing service along with them. So the Maliks, it comes from the word, of course, Malik, which means owner. Krishna is also our Malik. But within the Vaishya community, Malik usually means a zamindar or somebody who's very wealthy and he owns a lot of land, something like that. So that's where this Malik family name comes from. Although they were the seals and the days, they were both called Maliks. So Prabhupada's ancestry comes from this Saptagram area where Udaran Datta Thakur resided, a great devotee of Nityananda Prabhu. He was one of the 12 Sakas, Subahu, in Brajalila. And he had the right to worship Nityananda Prabhu. He has beautiful deities of Sadbhuj and Nityananda Prabhu and Gadadhar Pandit in Saptagram. And one of Prabhupada's godbrothers described that Srila Prabhupada, because according to the Gaudiya tradition, for instance, when you take sannyas, you're given the Gopi Baba mantra. So, and when we sing the Guru Vastakam every morning, Nikunja Yuno, Ratike. So the sannyasis, or those advanced, the acharyas, the gurus, they're supposed to be in Gopi Bhav. So Prabhupada's godbrother, he explained that Srila Prabhupada, he came to this Gopi Bhav through the friendly process, through Udaran Thakur, who was a Saka, through that process. He came up from that way. So this is, a lot of times there's, especially here in Vrindavan, they say, well, Prabhupada, he was just in Sakiras. This is way beyond our understanding. In order to come to Gopi Bhav, you have to go beyond. This is all Apaman. But the godbrother of Prabhupada explained it very sweetly, that from this friendly relationship, he came up to the Gopi Bhav relationship. So Srila Prabhupada, he appeared in that family under a jackfruit tree in Calcutta, just near where his house is. And he lived in the house of some Maliks, and the Maliks owned the whole area where he lived on Harrison Road. And then Prabhupada, he explained somewhere about his house. It also has a story that it was owned by one elderly woman, and she had a grandson, stepson or grandson, he says in two different places, and he was a drunkard. So without her knowledge, he sold the house one day for just a small amount of money, 7,000 rupees, because he wanted some money, because he was a drunkard. So the old woman, she took him to court, that the house doesn't belong to him, how could he sell it? Now he sold it, I have nowhere to live, what am I supposed to do? So the court decided that he takes half of the house and the old woman keeps another half of the house. And that was her portion of the house. They were Marwadis. And so within that house, Gaur Mahande, he rented one portion, an apartment. And that was where Prabhupada, he was the third son of Gaur Mahande. He was the pet son. Little son is always the pet son. So they grew up in that house. And because the woman was Marwadi, she started a school there. So you'll notice in Prabhupada's biography, he started the Motilal Seal Free School at age 8. That's because before age 8, Gaur Mahande, he was so attached to his Abai that he decided, well, there's a school right in our house here, Marwadi school, where they teach Hindi and Sanskrit. So I'll have my son study in this school until he gets old enough. Then he doesn't even have to go out of the house to go to school. So they're right in the house. This is how Prabhupada learned Hindi. This is how he learned Sanskrit. From age 6 to age 8, he was studying right there in the house at this Marwadi school. And then finally, at age 8, he began the Motilal Seal Free School. And Prabhupada, he was very intelligent and very naughty at the same time. His father wanted him to go to school. It was 8 years old. So Abai was thinking, well, I have a different idea. I'm just going to play all day. So every day he would make up excuses. He was sick, he was tired, something hurt. And his mother, she wanted to send him to school, but the father said, all right, tomorrow he'll go to school. So tomorrow. Finally, the mother hired someone, a young man named Damodar, and he had to pick him up and carry him to school. When he carried him to school, he would run out the door. And they'd pick him up again. Finally, after a few days, he stayed in the school and he started to learn nicely. So this went on until, of course, Prabhupada entered the Scottish Churches School, College. Now, in the Scottish Churches College, Prabhupada developed a respect for the fathers, because most of the teachers were renunciates. They were like brahmacharis. They had taken their vows. The Christians take vows similar to us. They vow celibacy and poverty and service, 3 things. And they're assigned. They're a lot more organized than we are. We have some free will where I'll go stay in this temple, that temple. No, they're assigned to different places around the world. Some have to go to Africa, some. So these particular fathers, they were coming from Scotland. And they were sent here to India. And the system is, amongst these Scottish fathers, wherever you're assigned, you have to learn the local language. So they all had to learn Bengali. So Prabhupada, learning from these educated gentlemen who even knew Bengali and knew their culture also, they would teach them folk tales and things like that. So that side by side they were learning their own culture and also the English and Christian culture. And in that school, in that college, Prabhupada even had to do compulsory Bible study every day for half an hour from 1 to 1:30. They would sit in a beautiful chapel and they would learn the Bible. So this was actually preparatory for Prabhupada's preaching. And he would sometimes have debates with his teachers, his philosophy teacher, because Prabhupada figured out the difference between Vedic philosophy and Christian philosophy while in that college. And he mentions it several times. He explains that the Christians do not believe in karma, and they don't understand the principle of Paramatma, the witness. The witness and the one who gives permission for things to be done. These are the Anumanta and the Drishta. I forget the Sanskrit word for witness. Anyone remember the Sanskrit word for? Upadrishta, yes, excuse me. Upadrishta. So they don't have that concept. They have something called the Holy Ghost, but it's not quite the Paramatma concept. So his professor, because professor is the one who's supposed to teach, so Prabhupada being a young boy, he couldn't counter his teacher. The professor says that according to your law of karma, in our previous birth we did something wrong, some sin, and therefore in this birth we have to suffer. But who was the witness? Because in law, in the court, unless you have a witness, you can't prove that someone committed a crime. Even if everyone knows the person committed the crime, unless there was a witness, and of course, if someone's going to commit a crime, they'll make sure that there are no witnesses. So that way, they're able to get free from the reaction of that crime. So the teacher, the father, would say, this law of karma is not correct because there's no witness to what we did in our previous life. Therefore, there's no proof that we're suffering now for our previous activities. So this Prabhupada understood finally what is the difference between Christian philosophy and Vedic philosophy. They don't understand Paramatma, and they don't understand that everything we do, everything we think is being seen by the Supreme Lord. And there is one law of physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But they don't see that in the course of sinful activity, because nobody knows what sins we committed in our past life. So because Prabhupada saw that difference at a young age, therefore later he studied, And when he spoke to scholars, theologians, professors in the Western countries, he already knew how to defeat them because he knew what their weakness was. They didn't understand that God sees everything that they do. And for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So this was how Prabhupada was able to defeat the Christian philosophy. Because at an early age, he found out what the fault was, what the deficiency was in their philosophy, not understanding the omnipresence and the omniscience of the Supreme Lord. So this was actually great training for Srila Prabhupada. In his childhood, he learned Hindi and Sanskrit. So the Sanskrit, he continued with the Sanskrit training. He was a very great Sanskrit scholar, even in his youth. And then he was able to understand the Christian theology and how to defeat it. At the same time, he was getting his Vaishnava training because his father was a pure devotee. Prabhupada explains that actually his business was puja. He would get up in the morning, he would worship his deities from 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock. He would be in there worshiping Gaurnitai, that was their Ishtadev in the house, and Radha Govindaji. And Prabhupada, Abhay, and his little sister, Baba Tarini, they would watch what their father did. And they would imitate. When he was 6 years old, he asked his father for his own Radha Govindaji deities. And just across the street was the Mulliks Radha Govindaji temple. And even when he was just a little child in his perambulator, his baby carriage, he would share it with his cousin, Subidi, and his cousin used to call him Moti. So the two of them would sit together in the pram, and one man would push them into the temple, and they would watch how they worshipped Radha Govindaji in the temple. So all of these impressions from their childhood, these are sanskars, the purificatory process. Sanskar means to cleanse. So he had such a beautifully purified childhood, seeing within his home the worship of Radha Govindaji and Gaurnitai, seeing within the temple this beautiful worship, and they would hours watch and see how the pujaris worship the deities. So at age 6, he asked his father for little Radha Govindaji deities, and his father gave him. Now they've been stolen. Because what happened was, when Prabhupada got into college, he didn't have time to, most of us were in college, we know that we just don't have time to do all the things that we would like to do in Krishna consciousness. So he didn't have time to worship his deities anymore. He put them in a box. And then one night he had a dream that Govinda said to him, "Why have you put me in this box? Take me out of this box. I'm hungry." So Prabhupada took him out of the box and he wanted to worship. He gave the deities to his sister. And we went to see those deities. His sister was so loving to Prabhupada's disciples. She would invite the disciples to her house. And she had a trick. She would cook so beautifully and so much. And she would feed us. You couldn't stop her. One time we were here in Prabhupada's house. When Pishima used to cook for Prabhupada, we would bring in Prabhupada's prasadam, and then after Prabhupada finished, we would bring the plate to the kitchen. It wasn't the kitchen now, it was in Prabhupada's bedroom. And then we would sit Pishima down, and we would feed her the remnants of Prabhupada's prasadam. And I would give her a little bit, and when she went like that, I had to stop. And one day, just by chance, I gave her a little more, and she got angry at me. And just as she got angry at me, Prabhupada came to the door. And he saw what I had done, that I had given her too much. And he got angry at me. So they were both angry at me because I had given her more than she asked for. So, but when we went to Pishima's house, it didn't matter what you did. You would be lying over your plate and she'd still be putting it on your plate. And you had to finish it because it was prasadam. So by the end of the meal, we'd all be lying down on the floor. And we wouldn't be able to leave the house. We'd have to go to sleep, and then it would be 4 o'clock in the afternoon until we finally crawl out of the house. No, we don't want any more prasadam. So, this is all the mercy of Radha Govindaji. So she would worship Radha Govindaji in her upper floor. She had 9 children, and in that one house, each grown child had their own room with their own family in each room. It was real beautiful, united family. And they would all worship Radha Govindaji. And then Radha Govindaji, when Srila Prabhupada entered Samadhi, Pishima's life was finished. So she came to Mayapur, and of course she wanted to stay in Mayapur. But the sannyasi didn't want her to stay in Mayapur. They said, you have your children, you go back to your house, you go stay with your children. That's the proper thing to do. So by that time she was so old, one of the sannyasis, they said she didn't want to leave Mayapur. So he said, pick her up and carry her down the stairs and put her in the car. We're taking her back to Calcutta. So Pishima looked just like Prabhupada. So when Nitai Chand picked her up and was carrying her down the stairs, Pishima looks at the sannyasi with the same eyes as Srila Prabhupada. And when the sannyasi sees Pishima's face, he said, no, we can't let her go. She has to stay here in Mayapur. So because she stayed in Mayapur, she had Radha Govindaji come to Mayapur. And they were put on the altar, Prabhupada's original deities, and they were worshipped with Radha Madhava, the 18-inch Radha Madhava that were originally worshipped there. So Radha Govindaji stayed in Mayapur until one day, I think it was after Prabhupada left, it was the second time Mayapur was attacked by Gundas. The Gundas had heard that inside of each shalagram shila there was gold. And the deities were being worshipped so beautifully that they also looked like gold. So the Gundas came one night and they stole the only shalagram shila we had, Sri Gadadhar, and they stole Prabhupada's Radha Govindaji deities, and they stole Radharani of Radha Madhava, thinking that they were all gold, and took them away. So now none of us will be able to get darshan of Radha Govindaji. They were just little 4-inch deities that Prabhupada worshipped. And from the worship of those Radha Govindaji deities, Prabhupada developed his strong attachment to their lordships from his childhood. So then Prabhupada, as a householder, I can't see the time. 5:20, okay. Because Prabhupada's father, because he was a pure devotee Vaishnava, he knew that if Prabhupada were to marry the girl of his choice, he would be very attached to his householder life. So his father chose a girl that Prabhupada was not attracted to. Her name was Radharani Datta. From a very good family, wealthy family, nice. It was a nice match, but Prabhupada didn't want to marry her. He wanted to marry another girl. So Gaur Mahande explained to him that if you marry the girl of your choice and you're very attached to your wife, how are you going to ever renounce your family life? You have to plan ahead. So it's better you marry someone that you're not very attracted to. He was so, Gaur Mahande gave the best advice. If you want to make spiritual advancement, don't marry someone that you're attracted to. So, just to please his father, he married Radharani, but he still wanted to marry the other girl. So Pishima was telling me one day, he said that Prabhupada came to her, he said, I'm going to make a second marriage. But then again, Gaur Mahande, he convinced him, no, you stay in this marriage, and I assure you that you'll get the most benefit by just following your duties within this Grihastha ashram. Don't do a second marriage. So Prabhupada, he followed his father's advice, being a pure devotee, and that way he was very easily able to give up his family life just at the right time, at age 50. That was when he decided that it was a hopeless situation. And it was hopeless in this sense, that though his wife was a Vaishnava, she felt that worship should just be done at home at our convenience. And because Prabhupada understood that his family wasn't inclined towards Vaishnavism and towards serving the Guru so seriously as he was, he didn't engage in deity worship in his house. He only worshipped photos of Panchatattva, Radha Krishna, and his Guru. But he would do all of the puja to those photos. And his wife also took initiation. She took initiation from Srila Prabhupada's godbrother, Bhakti Saranga Swami, who has the Imli Tala Mandir. His samadhi is there. So she also took Diksha, but did not have the same commitment that Srila Prabhupada had. So therefore, following the advice of his father, of his dear father, and then finally, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Prabhupada's eternal father, after having met him in 1922, although Prabhupada was trying to carry out all of his duties in family life, because that spark of meeting his spiritual master for the first time, he could never forget him. And he was always meditating on that instruction given to him at their first meeting, that you're an intelligent young man, you should preach this philosophy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the English language. So he was meditating, how could he do that? So, being a businessman, and in the Day family, he was very successful originally in his business, in his chemical business. Had he continued in that line, he would have been the wealthiest in the laboratory business. But he wanted to do the 50% as Rupa Goswami recommended. He wanted to use his money also to help the Gaudiya Math mission of his spiritual master. And when you try to do two things at one time, it's like having one foot in one field and a fence and one foot in another field. It's a very uncomfortable situation. So ultimately, one or the other has to win. Either you become a complete materialist and become very wealthy, or you become a complete failure in materialism and become perfect in your spiritual life. So because Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had specially blessed Prabhupada, and we won't have time today to talk about the blessings that he received later, but because he received special notice from his spiritual master to go to the West, to preach, because none of the other godbrothers were enthusiastic to do that. Although Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had spent the blood money of Gaudiya Math to send two sannyasis, one to Germany, one to England, neither of them were successful. They came back unsuccessful. But Srila Prabhupada, and we'll find out about things that we don't hear about much. Do any of you know that Srila Prabhupada actually established the Gaudiya Math at Bombay? Aside from Allahabad, he also went to Bombay with his godbrothers. And they had preaching teams. Just like we go out to make life members, they had preaching teams. There were three men in a team. And Prabhupada had all of his contacts from his business. So he already had so many people that he knew in Bombay. And he took his group, which is Sridhar Maharaj and one other brahmachari, and they went and they got donations to start a Gaudiya Math in Bombay. And finally, when it was time to open up that center in Bombay, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati came. And even at that time, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was saying, yes, we've opened up this center in Bombay. But my father, and even Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's mother, her last wish to him was to spread this Harinam all over the world. What a wonderful mother that was. So he was also always meditating on the work started by his father and the wish of his mother, the final wish of his mother, to spread Krishna consciousness worldwide. So when the Bombay temple was open, he was telling the different devotees, the senior devotees to Prabhupada, that you go now to America, you go to England. And one of them, they cried. They said, I can't bear the separation from you, Guru Maharaj. I can't leave. Please don't send me away. So they didn't have that same inspiration that Srila Prabhupada had to fulfill, even at the expense of his own life, his own family, everything, giving up everything, just to fulfill the order of his spiritual master and carry the message of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu all over the world. Okay, I think tomorrow we'll continue with Prabhupada's glories. Hare Krishna. Jai.
Hare Krishna. So, Diva Shakti Mataji, of course, 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago, when I went to a temple in Philadelphia, she was there. Husband was temple president. I have an idea you were very much temple president person as well at that time even. But we were both from Philadelphia area, maybe 10 miles apart, different places. Now we're many, many miles apart. She's Brijbasi. I love listening to everything she says, her devotion, the service to Srila Prabhupada. Just offering dandavats. I've done that many times in this room. 1974, 1975 for Srila Prabhupada. There were many things I wanted to say. We have a few days, not nearly enough time, 2-3 hours to talk about Srila Prabhupada. The one thing she was talking about towards the end was Prabhupada's father. How he directed Prabhupada so much in his life, almost knowing what Prabhupada was going to do. And Prabhupada told that to me in Juhu one evening when I was giving him massage under the mosquito net. And Prabhupada, like everything he did, wherever he was, whatever he was speaking about, he was there. When he was listening to Krishna book, he was there. He was there in the pastime. If he would speak about his youth, talk about college, he would go right there. He could bring you there, wherever he was. And that evening he had puffed rice and milk. Puffed rice was one of his favorites. And as I was massaging him, he began to speak about that way back into when he was just a young boy. He said a few things. He talked about how his mother made puffed rice. And he was so descriptive. He said the wok, very thick wok, he said, because you'd have to make very, very hot, filled with sand. He described the whole process as I'm massaging his legs, massaging his feet. And then he said, my father, he said sometimes at night when I was young, his mother again would want to give him puffed rice. He said, but I wanted puris. And his mother said, no, it's too late. You have puffed rice, not puris. Prabhupada, saying no to Prabhupada was never a good answer, even when he was a child. You couldn't, his determination was, it was very strong. So again, he said, and he's speaking again, but when he speaks again, you try to imagine Prabhupada being this big or this big or this big. And so in that way, you would just be there with him. And everything I always saw was everything was connected with service. You do your service. I could never let go Otherwise, that connection wouldn't be there. It was only through your service he would give you so much in return. And again, he said, no, I want puris. And again, his mother refused. His mother was the disciplinarian, not father. Father was a softie. So finally, again, he said no. And he's speaking, and you just see him as a child speaking. You don't see him as some 75-year-old he becomes that person. Whenever he would speak, he was the one-act play. All the parts, he would play them. His inflections and his conversation, he'd just bring you there. No, I want puris. And then the father, he said, my father said, if he wants puris, you give him puris. And then he just looked at me, he said, perhaps my father knew. And that was all. You would never get more than that. And me, I never asked, well, knew what? You knew. Perhaps my father knew. His father knew. And just listening again to Daiva Shakti, you see it over and over again. His father had those expectations. He understood who Prabhupada was. I wanted to read a little something. It's a narrative from Hayagriva's book, Vrindavan Days. I just wanted to start off with that a little bit. I was reading it the other day, and some of you know who Hayagriva Prabhu, one of Prabhupada's very first disciples. He was, like Brahmananda was big devotee, Hayagriva was big in every way. He was gigantic. His voice was so deep. He was professor. So he was there from the beginning. So when Prabhupada came to Vrindavan in 1972, Radha Damodar Temple, for the entire month of Kartik, which he had planned months in advance, Prabhupada was so looking forward to coming to Vrindavan at that time to speak from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, his Nectar of Devotion. And this was Hayagriva's first trip to Vrindavan. Imagine, after 6 years. And the things that he says in here, Prabhupada's reactions and comments, they're just so wonderful, give you a little idea of the relationship Prabhupada had with his disciples, especially these very early disciples. So as Hayagriva comes, and I'm there at this time, I'm literally in my very first month. Now I've been with Prabhupada 1 month, and left the USA for the first time, and Prabhupada brought me right, not just to India, he brought me right to Vrindavan. After arriving in Delhi, spending overnight, next day was first day of Kartik. Prabhupada was right to Vrindavan. So my entrance into India was coming right to Vrindavan in 1972. So Hayagriva comes, and he sees Jamuna, who he knew very well. He says to her, a lot of visitors? She says, oh no, she says, just you go right in. This was also another feature that only happened in India. Everywhere, by 1972, you never just walked into Srila Prabhupada's room. There was many layers of devotees who could stop you, and prevent you, with so many reasons, all coming from Prabhupada's lotus lips, apparently. But she said, no, you go right in. So now this is his descriptions. This is Hayagriva, amazing writer. I bend down to go through the door and enter a small, sparsely furnished room. If you haven't been there, you have to go there. Suddenly, I'm face to face with Srila Prabhupada. He's sitting on the floor behind a low desk piled with books and papers. Jai, he says, our Hayagriva has arrived. Again, he didn't just say Hayagriva, our Hayagriva. This is also how Prabhupada spoke. It was never I this or you, it was always we, our. He was inclusive, he always included, you always felt part of what he was doing. You were part of his family. wasn't just some big society. It was a family, and no matter how big it had become, you felt like you were part of his family. So he says, our Hayagriva has arrived. He says, I paid Dandabats, prostrating myself, touching his feet with my right hand. Something else didn't happen very often after 1972. Then I placed my hand to my forehead. To remember the spiritual master's lotus feet is to remember Krishna. The effect is as cooling as sandalwood. Namam Vishnupadaya Krishna Pastaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namane. Prabhupada's feet were, I can attest to that, I touched them many times giving massage. They were cooling. Prabhupada's feet, you would massage. They were very soft, very cool, and very pinkish. Sometimes I would think about his feet. I did many things for Prabhupada. Right there where you're sitting, I shaved him in 1974 when he was ill. He had me shave his face with a razor blade. One time in 2.5 years. Other than giving him massage and doing some things. But his nails, they look like they never grew. He tended to himself very nicely. His feet were always perfectly pure and clean and soft, nothing hard. His nails were always trimmed very nicely. One of the things that was in the white bag, he had this file, about 8 inches long, little sharp thing on one end, a little pick on the other end, I imagine, for the ears. I don't know how he did it, but he took care of that himself. So yes, so then he goes on, although 76, Prabhupada seems as ageless as ever. This next description, people ask me what it was like when you first see Srila Prabhupada, and I've given my descriptions, but this description is just beyond anything I could say. His head is freshly shaved, and the aroma of mustard seed oil tells me that he has just received his massage. His complexion is radiant, his eyes clear, his face full and healthy. This is the face that attracted me that day when I was walking down New York's Houston Street and first met him. The face that brought so many young seekers to that little storefront temple on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. For us, his face embodies all the attractive qualities of devotion, for its pure, truthful, and compassionate face. It is both happy and grave. It is magnanimous, gentle, and forgiving. It's also determined and self-controlled, and above all, most learned and intelligent. It's a face not afraid to love and give all in love for Krishna. Indeed, Prabhupada's face conjures all those virtues that lead to love of Krishna. It's not an ordinary man's face. It transports an entire spiritual fact, the Vedic culture, an atmosphere of bhakti. I first began realizing his potency just by looking at his face. Whenever I'm Krishna conscious, it makes me joyful. This next line I love. Whenever I'm not, I'm afraid to look at it. Hayagriva was so open in his feelings. It accuses me, makes me ashamed without uttering a word. Prabhupada could do that, just look at you and didn't have to say a word. He would learn. He learned. With me, he did that. Hardly ever yelled at me. Just look at me. And he could turn you to dust just by a look. What power there is in the spiritual master's face. What magnetism. What volumes of wisdom. So then Prabhupada, just seeing Hayagriva, so happy to see him in Vrindavan. I'll just read a few more lines. So when did you come? He asked, smiling. Hayagriva describes there were delays. So then Prabhupada says, oh, so you've come as Professor Wheeler, laughing, referring to his black suit. Hayagriva says, only because you requested it, Srila Prabhupada. He says, yes, that's very nice. You can speak at our functions and convince many gentlemen to help. They may not listen to us, but an American professor, oh. He smiles broadly, looks at me as if I were a Harvard professor emeritus instead of a lowly Ohio State instructor. So how are you finding Vrindavan? This is where it gets very interesting. Prabhupada explains all about what it's like to be in Vrindavan. He hesitates. As always, no one else is speaking once you're in the room with Prabhupada. He said, well, I saw the bazaar on the way. I'm afraid I'm going to need a guide to explain everything. I never thought a place could exist, I say. Just passing the bazaar was an experience in Krishna consciousness. And this is so nice. Prabhupada says, I told you. Remember? In 26 Second Avenue, I was telling you and Kirtanananda and others about this Vrindavan atmosphere. How I was always longing for it there in New York. So this was Prabhupada being there in New York. Always just wanting to go back in that little humble room there at Radha Damodar Temple, just to be in Vrindavan. But instead, he gave everyone Vrindavan. He said, even the monkeys here in Vrindavan seem extraordinary, Shyama Sundar said. Prabhupada says, no one born in Vrindavan is ordinary. It may not be very palatable to hear, but those who live in Vrindavan and commit sinful activities take birth as dogs, monkeys, and hogs. In this way, by eating the dust of Vrindavan, they become purified, liberated. And Prabhupada describes the different animals, how they take birth. And then Guru Das, who's very, could be very funny, very humorous. He says, and what about those men down by the river who smoke ganja all day? Prabhupada looks, oh. He said, they get hippie bodies with big beards and long hair, and they have to take birth in San Francisco. This he's saying right to Guru Das. This was Guru Das's position. Prabhupada always knew exactly what to say. On every level, he could speak. Anyway, it goes on and on. Everyone should read it. I could spend the whole hour just reading this. I find it so wonderful. Because he didn't understand Vrindavan, and Prabhupada kept explaining over and over. You can't see Vrindavan with these material eyes. You have to get the vision through the spiritual master. Otherwise, we think it's just another noisy place, dirty place. This is what Hayagriva was saying. I remember when I came here, everything I had heard about in Bhagavad-Gita, it existed right here in Vrindavan. You saw the dogs, the hogs, the camels, and the asses. You saw the camels eating the thorny bushes in the trees that Prabhupada spoke about, enjoying their own blood, the taste of blood as they're eating the leaves on the trees. You saw the hogs happy, lying in the sewers. Devotees here, they would go into the fields to pass. There was nowhere else to go. They would bring sticks with them. The hogs were so hungry, they would come after you sometimes. They would attack you, even as you were passing. They were so eager. I would see dead bodies lying on the side of the road, being eaten by vultures. Now we don't see so many of any of these things. Vultures have disappeared for one reason or another. We were on a morning walk here when they first got the land. Prabhupada would walk there on Chittakara Road, it was called. We learned so much. Just everything he said was a learning experience. He said, as he was walking, one house, there was a little and on the top of it was a vulture sitting there. Prabhupada just looked. He said, someone's going to die in that house. That was it, finished. And you just knew it was the truth. Prabhupada only spoke the truth. Walking by Keshagat, time I would walk by, you'd smell such horrible smell. Body had been lying in there for days. This was to be in Vrindavan in those days. But Prabhupada always wanted to come to Vrindavan. So when he was ill, first thing he did was come back to Vrindavan. I stayed in that room right behind this fireplace, that little room at that time in 74, 75. Library wasn't there. So it was compact, Prabhupada's quarters. I sleep on a mat just like this. That was it. We were simple. No mosquito nets, just there. Prabhupada would walk through, and then he would go into his room where the bathroom was to use the bathroom. Any time of the day or night. Many times of the day or night Prabhupada would use. She was talking about Pishima, another amazing thing. When you first see her, you don't know what to think, because here's this person that looks just like Prabhupada. Who could look like Prabhupada? But here was this shorter version of him. Prabhupada, sometimes he would refer to her as my fat sister. He was a true older brother, Prabhupada, with his sister. Loved her very much, took care of her in every way, and vice versa. When she was here in Vrindavan, she would come to Vrindavan. Prabhupada said, how did she get here? She had nothing. She was just a poor old lady living there in Calcutta. They said, oh, Prabhupada, your disciples, female disciples, they arranged for her flight. Prabhupada would just shake his head. All right. And then all she wanted to do was be here. She adored Prabhupada. Said he could eat nails if he wanted. When we would try to restrict his food intake, she'd look, he can eat nails if he wants. She had more faith than we did in Prabhupada's transcendental position. So she would come, sit down. One day she was sitting right there again, right there next to the desk. And I'm sitting in there, so just sit there. That was servant. You sat right next to Prabhupada's room 24 hours a day. That was our business. And you had to figure out how to survive those 24 hours a day, what to do. 21 years old, 22 years old, just sitting. You ring the bell. Came in, offer obeisances. I could offer obeisances 100 times a day. He never stopped me. He never said, you've done it enough today. You don't have to do it after noon or anything, 10 times. No, every time, down on the ground. So I went down, I got up. He said, sit down. Just pointed right there. Sit down, he said. He said, even she's my sister, they'll talk. They will talk. They meant these people here in Vrindavan, all these Goswamis in their temples, just always looking for something to criticize. Because he changed everything. He changed everything what was going on in Vrindavan. And I would just sit there, and they would talk in Bengali, sometimes talking, sometimes little yelling. Prabhupada was always correcting her, because she would complain how she was sick. And then he'd say, well, look at you. He'd say, you're so fat, And she'd say, well, I'm not eating. He said, how can you be so fat if you're not eating? He said to me, do you know anyone? He said, that can be fat without eating? I said, no, Prabhupada. My sister says so. He would bring you in sometimes. You were with him 24 hours a day. You were just a servant like all of us. but sometimes he made you feel so special. He made everyone feel special. Us, we, our. Never, I'm doing this, you go do that. No, it wasn't like that with Prabhupada. We were together. He made you feel part of him. So then that afternoon, this was after I had malaria for like the second time. First time I went in, he would go to the bathroom. It's lunchtime. He had been sick. This was 1974. At that time, his bed was over here. For days and days, weeks, just sitting in the bed, lying in the bed, not eating, just taking juice out of an orange. That's when, as Maharaj said in that one class, that's when 24-hour kirtan started. And then after he started to get well, Kuladri, he was also helping at that time, New Vrindavan Kuladri. I got very sick. I got malaria because you're lying on the floor, no mosquito net, because we were transcendental. Prabhupada told us we were transcendental. So we didn't care about mosquitoes. We didn't care about the water we were drinking, where it came from, what might be in it. No, and in the meantime, no one was healthy. None of us were healthy. Prabhupada wrote a letter at that time while I was ill saying, even Sruta Kirti, he said, Bardara, Sruta Kirti, not well. He said, this atmosphere here, he said, is not very good for health. He says, being in India, not very good. So the one day, right at lunchtime, he's walking through the room, and I'm lying on the floor, literally dying. And he looks, and everyone is sitting right there in the center of the room. My godbrother's secretary, Sanskrit editor, maybe Maharaj, Tamal Krishna, eating Prabhupada's remnants, everyone enjoying like anything. And I'm lying there. And Prabhupada walks by to use the bathroom, and he said, is anyone taking care of Sruta Kirti? And I heard it, and I thought, Prabhupada. And they just looked up, hand in their mouth. Huh? He said, get him a bed. He said, call the doctor. He said, someone bring him a Nimbu Pani. That's what I remember the most, was this Nimbu Pani. Prabhupada loved Nimbu Pani. He said, from a child, he said, I love Nimbu Pani. So what it costs? A few annas less than pice or more. I don't know. Anyway, he said, just cost a pice, this Nimbu Pani. He said, bring him a Nimbu Pani. So they did. Then they arranged typical bed, had a bed, got my Nimbu Pani. Doctor came with the little white pills, homeopathic doctor, and within a few days I was feeling better. So now I had the bed there. So now Pishima's here. So after the conversation that day, bring Prabhupada his lunch, everything. Prabhupada goes to his room, he takes a nap. So now by this time, I had been with Prabhupada almost 2 years. Something I never did before was take a nap. When you were with Prabhupada, you would take a nap because your evenings could go very late. So I went to the room to take a nap. Lie in my nice bed, Prabhupada got me. And there's this little female Prabhupada, his sister, lying in my bed, sleeping like a baby. So what could I do? I went out to the front and I just sat there. So I was Prabhupada's son. I had nothing else. I was with Prabhupada. So when he got up in the afternoon, of course, I went into the room. If you went into a room and he didn't call you, he would give you that look like, yes, like, what are you doing? And I said, Prabhupada, I said, your sister's sleeping in my bed. He just shook his head. He said, she can't do that. Same thing. People will talk. Now she's sleeping in the bed in Prabhupada's quarters. This is impossible. He said, tell her, she can't do that. I said, Prabhupada, I said, I can't tell her anything. I said, she, besides not speaking Bengali, she didn't even like me. I was the only person in ISKCON I think she didn't like because I would restrict her from seeing Prabhupada, which I was, part of my service was to do that at certain times, as he told me. So I said, I can't say anything to her, Prabhupada. He said, all right. He said, you call her, have her come in. He said, I'll talk to her. Yes, Prabhupada, I was so happy. So I got her. Prabhupada wants to see you. Like everyone, when you would say, Prabhupada wants to see you, they get a big smile on their face. But usually if he wanted to see you, it was not a happy time because he was going to chastise you. You're thinking, oh, Prabhupada wants to see me. He wanted to see you was to correct you about something. So same thing, I said, Prabhupada wants to see you. She was so beautiful. Black horn-rimmed glasses. 10 meters of cloth wrapped around her. Right? That's all she had was that sari wrapped and wrapped and wrapped, Bengali style. So she got right up, came in, sat right there. So then, of course, conversation went on in Bengali for a few minutes. It seemed like it went very well. And then Prabhupada looks at me and he said, okay. He said, don't worry. He said, it won't happen again. I said, thank you, Prabhupada. So 24 hours later, Prabhupada takes a nap. I go to my room. There's Pishima lying in the bed. She was more like Prabhupada. She was like Prabhupada. Didn't listen to anyone. She did what she wanted, you know. So I just looked and, all right, I surrendered. I surrendered to Prabhupada's sister. We came to Vrindavan, same thing happened with Hayagriva. His rooms at Radha Damodar temple. To walk into his rooms, of course, they had just the little doors with the shutters, huh? Maybe not even 4 foot high, 3.5 foot high doors, just over a meter. Hayagriva mentions when he went in, having to bend down so much. Again, he was 2 meters tall. Me, every time Prabhupada rang the bell, that was the first thing I learned. He rings the bell, you don't walk to his room. You run to the room. You don't want him to have to ring it twice. Once for a few seconds, you respond. That was being servant. So there at Radha Damodar, I would sit on that veranda between his 2 rooms, the kitchen and his sitting room. Or the one time he rang the bell, so I ran into the room, and of course the walls are this thick. They're not like this, they're like this thick, you know, like 2 feet thick. So I went into the room to see him, and I lifted my head and I pounded it on the concrete, right on the concrete wall. I said I saw Brahma Jyoti. So being, of course, ashamed and embarrassed, I just offered obeisances. As soon as I look up, Prabhupada went, ooh. He said, that's to teach you how to become humble. This was everything Prabhupada said was perfect. But those days, Radha Damodar temple, every day, every place with Prabhupada was so special. To be there at that time during Kartik, the entire month of Kartik, was one of the first big festivals, I say, in ISKCON. Maybe 40 devotees there. That was huge. And Prabhupada, just like his Howard Wheeler, he's a Professor Wheeler, he told him to come in a suit with tilak, nice bright tilak on the forehead. He said the same thing to Kirtanananda when he said, just like Kirtanananda. He told Kirtanananda to wear a suit. He went there in the summertime, Kirtanananda, his first trip. He had a wool suit. He said he almost suffocated. He was wearing every day. Prabhupada showed him off his disciple, his first disciple, wearing a wool suit, but he had his Vaishnava tilak on. Prabhupada saw that as a big bonus to come here. Not having dhoti and kurta, but to see this Westerners, these white Westerners, wearing their Western clothing, and I've turned them into Vaishnavas. This was Prabhupada's glory. He was proud. He was proud of us. I always say if he was speaking with us in the room, no one else was there, not so proud. He could make fun of us. He never, well, he did once or twice, but he never would say something complimentary about you in your presence. Usually he would say something instruction, chastise you, tell you, why don't you do this? Why are you doing this? Like that. But if there were outsiders present, especially here in India, if they were all his disciples, they were the best in the world. He saw us. This boy here, his father's a millionaire. And he's here, he's given up everything to be devotee. This is how Prabhupada used us all perfectly. He would use us. That was our good fortune. He just used us in Krishna's service. He's still using us if we allow him to use us. That's our glory. Right? That's what it means to become servant, become dog, Prabhupada would say. The Radha Damodar temple. First ones there, of course, were Guru Das and Jamuna. She said when she got there, Prabhupada's rooms, no one had been there for 3-4 years after Prabhupada left. They had been locked up, closed. She said literally the dust, 2-3 inches thick on everything. And their responsibility, clean everything, prepare for Prabhupada's coming. And he gave them a very difficult instruction. In that room, in his trunks, he had all his papers, all his business papers from his grahastha life, everything he had done, and everything, just like when you read in the diary, or when you see his first few years in New York, everything he did, every paisa was accounted for. Nothing was just happened. Something came in, he wrote it down, how much was collected. You'll see in the diary, sometimes he'll put, bought salt, 7 cents, is 5 cents, everything. And this is how we were trained up as well. Sometimes if you think Prabhupada's disciples were a little fanatic, were a little over the top, little crazy, we are, because we were trained that way by Prabhupada. Everything you do. Prabhupada said, Krishna has accountants recording everything that we do. So Prabhupada was recording everything he did. His whole history was there, what he was doing even before he was sannyas. And he told them, Guru Das and Jamuna, he said, you take all those papers and burn them. Jamuna said it was the hardest, most difficult instruction she ever received. They took everything. They collected all these papers from Srila Prabhupada. They brought them to the Jamuna. They had a big bonfire. They just lit everything up as Prabhupada had instructed. He just literally just took away that whole part. But that was up to Prabhupada. It's what he did. And she described how the place, now of course if you go to Radha Damodar temple, you go in the courtyard, you would have no idea what the courtyard was like in Prabhupada's day. Anyway, many of us find it very sad the way they've developed that place. It was very simple. You had the samadhi there, Bhajan Kutir, but it was just Raj, just the dust, the dirt was everywhere. There was nothing else there. They even had to make a little platform, little area where Prabhupada would sit to give the classes. Everything was so simple. But Prabhupada describes in his Vrindavan days by Hayagriva how he saw that most wonderful place. He said, looking out his windows as he would do his translating work. He said all his inspiration came from that. He said, just seeing Rupa Goswami's samadhi. And he describes, of course, he said, I did the first canto. He said, and I knew English wasn't so good. He said, but still, I had to do it. He said, I wanted to have something to bring to the West. And he said at that time, he said, everything you need, he said, to become Krishna conscious is in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. He said, I put everything in there. He said, because I didn't know if I would do anything more. He said, so it's all there in the first canto. And then he described that place, he said, is the very center of the spiritual universe, those rooms at Radha Damodar Temple. Because there, he said, Krishna consciousness movement began. But again, he didn't take credit for it. He said, by Srila Rupa Goswami's mercy. This was Srila Prabhupada. He understood he was doing, like he said, perhaps my father knew. I traveled with him the next year when we came here, when he came here for the opening. He had left January from Mumbai, Bombay, and he went around the world in 2 months. And he wound up back in Mayapur in March, and then gradually he came to Vrindavan. But in those 2 months, he visited a dozen places all around the world. He stopped in Japan, Hawaii, where often would stop going one way or the other from the mainland US to Japan, to India. So he stopped in Hawaii, Los Angeles, and then a very special part of his trip, he went to Mexico City, and then he went to Caracas, and then he went to the USA. But when he went to Mexico City, now there's hundreds of devotees. The temple there in Mexico City, the same temple is still there. But now he sees Krishna consciousness is not just in the United States and Europe. It's gone everywhere. Every place Srila Prabhupada went at those times, a little bit of ecstasy leaked out that he couldn't control. Prabhupada always controlled his ecstatic symptoms, most always. But during this trip, in the course of 2 months, I saw him personally 4 times on the Vyasa-san stop, where he couldn't speak anymore. And each time, it was when he would start to talk about Lord Chaitanya and Lord Nityananda, how merciful they are. So that was, to me, 10 years later, it was the time when he saw Krishna consciousness has gone all over the world, everywhere. It wasn't just here and there. Everyone was chanting Hare Krishna. So each place he went to, he would start to give the arrival address. And then somewhere in the course of that speaking, he would just have to stop. He'd close his eyes. It was always the same. Close his eyes. Everyone would become quiet. Sometimes you'd see the tears, sometimes not, but you always saw that same just ecstatic symptoms. Krishna consciousness has gone everywhere. So it happened in Mexico City. Then he went to Caracas, Venezuela. And there again, Lord Chaitanya. There in South America, it was always Gornitai, Lord Chaitanya, Lord Nityananda. They're on the altar in this pretty rented place in Caracas, Venezuela. And Prabhupada sees dozens of devotees. Some of them are right here now. Karta, Virabahu. There were Bhakta and Bhaktin. 1974, 1975. Javi, he was there in Caracas at that time. And Prabhupada seeing these devotees, his disciples, but he's looking at Lord Chaitanya, Lord Nityananda, and he looks at the crowd and his followers, and he says, Lord Chaitanya has traveled very far, he said, to be with you. Was Prabhupada traversing the world. I realized that recently when first time I went to South Africa, went to Mauritius. Hopefully in the near future I'll go to Japan for the first time. But all I'm doing is going to places where Prabhupada placed his lotus feet. And wherever he placed those feet, he planted seeds. That's what he did. It wasn't just some haphazard, he'd like to travel. He knew what he was doing. He knew the necessity. Only he could bring Krishna consciousness. It was his empoweredness that made it possible. Everywhere he went, a temple sprung up. That's what I saw when I went to Africa, South Africa. They took me to this town. Prabhupada gave a lecture here, they would say. They would go to this place. Oh, Prabhupada walked along the beach here. Everywhere, it was the same thing. He made devotees. Sometimes those seeds might come up 40, 50 years later. Wasn't always immediately. But he was so determined to go to as many places as possible to inspire his disciples. But it was more than that. He was inspiring. He was changing all the living entities wherever he went. And they became devotees. Again, I saw this in South Africa. I was so happy just to see. So this is what he was doing now. He was going one place to the next. He went to Caracas. Caracas was one, I tell this story all the time. I knew all the devotees in Caracas because I had been there for 6 months. I was with Prabhupada 16 months as a brahmachari, and then Los Angeles, I left, became Grahasta, left his service. Satsvarup Maharaj became his servant. So I was gone for 8 months. 6 of those months I was in Caracas, Venezuela. I was speaking every day. I was working in the kitchen. I was the Brahmin in the temple in Caracas, 1975, the only Brahmin devotee. So then, later I left. I wound up back in New Vrindavan, September of 74. So who should be coming back to New Vrindavan? The same place I became his servant in 1972, Janmashtami. 2 years later, it's Janmashtami 1974. Now I'm there with my wife, staying in a little Prabhupada hut. Prabhupada comes back to New Vrindavan. And just like 2 years before, his servant wasn't with him anymore. Satsvarup Maharaj again wanted to go preach, distribute books, do the library party, go to the colleges. So he left Prabhupada after 6 months. So now Prabhupada came to New Vrindavan. And again I joined him. It was Brahmananda. Brahmananda Maharaj was his secretary. And I was very lost. You want to read, Hayagriva talks about being lost. I was lost there in New Vrindavan, had no idea what I was doing. Prabhupada was there for a week. I hardly engaged in any service to him. And just like the previous 2 years before, the day before he left, first time it was Kirtanananda Maharaj, this time it was Brahmananda, said to me, "Do you want to be Prabhupada's servant?" And of course me, having my experience here in India, half of the time with Prabhupada, I said, "Where's he going?" The thought of coming to India was frightening to me. Because all I did was get sick. I said, "Where are you headed?" He says, "We're going to India." And I looked up at the Prabhupada hut. It was like 30 feet up there. And my wife was inside there. And I looked at Brahmananda and I said, "Yes, I'll come." And again, I was Prabhupada's servant. And it was the most unceremonious occasion ever. Brahmananda came in the room, we went in together, just like the first time with Kirtanananda. We sat before Prabhupada, offered obeisances. This time he didn't have to introduce me as Sruta Kirti. He knew very well who I was. I was the person that abandoned him 8 months prior. So he looked, and Brahmananda said, so Sruta Kirti, it's okay, he'll come and be servant? Prabhupada just said, okay. That was it. That was the extent of it. Didn't ask me any questions. Didn't ask me what I had been doing with my life for the last 8 months. My wife was going to have a child. None of that. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered. All that mattered is now I'm going to come and do my service as I should. It was the only thing that was important. I've been saying that in classes. Prabhupada, you didn't go into Prabhupada's room, he wouldn't say, are you chanting your rounds? He would say, what are you doing? What are you doing to help? So that was it. Now I was going to be his servant. Very good. So there in Caracas, Prabhupada ascended onto the Vyasasan. Me, I had so many duties. See, these were the duties at that time. You take his cane, you might take off his socks, put on his socks, take off his sweater, take his chadar, give him a chadar. So many things. This was a duty, personal servant. Personal. Everything is personal. But I was busy looking just like you. I was looking, oh yeah, hey, Hari, Hari, you're Bahu, Hari. I'm with Prabhupada. I'm in my rightful place. And then I got hit in the head. And Prabhupada took his socks off. He rolled them into a ball and he threw them at me. Because I was lost. Again, I wasn't doing my service. I was just trying to enjoy my position. Here I am, Prabhupada's servant. I wasn't serving. I was third class. Prabhupada would say fourth class, fifth class. Prabhupada had many classes. Sometimes you could go up to 10th class person. We really wanted to. He'd say, you're 10th class man. Now he hit me in the head with his socks. Such a blessing. And again, just by those socks hitting me in my head, I regained my consciousness. I knew what my business was. So I assumed my service at that time. So I think we're doing this again tomorrow. You're doing tomorrow. Yes. And then the next day, I'll be doing it the next day, and then the next day will be Prabhupada's disappearance day. So it's Panchagoda's desire we do this. And to come into Prabhupada's room here is very, very special. It started out when the discussion was taking place. The garden was presented, and there were, due to the darkness and things, and those same descendants of the mosquitoes from 1972 that were, they're there. And then the library was there. Daiva Shakti, she suggested Prabhupada's room. So all very, very fortunate to be here in this place, to be in this very special place, as Prabhupada calls it. He says, everything's going on here. This was always, I agree with saying, but yes, but the smell is there and people are starving. And Prabhupada, he'd say, who's starving? He said, I don't see anyone starving. He said, you can go to any temple here, he said, and get some prasadam. And he said, as far as sleeping, he said, what does it matter? He said, you're sleeping on a stone road or you're sleeping in a nice soft bed. He said, when you're sleeping, do you realize whether you're on a stone ground or you're in a soft bed? So Prabhupada never accepted any of our arguments. We know when the reporter once said, in India, so many people are dying. You couldn't not defeat Prabhupada. And usually it didn't take long, and he'd say, everyone, 100% of people are dying everywhere in the world. Not they're just dying in India. Everywhere people are dying. So this was Prabhupada's way. I always say when when he was having conversations with reporters, was never defensive. We say we know that in American football, they say, best defense is good offense. So Prabhupada always had the best offense. He wouldn't become defensive. He would just defeat you by becoming even more, just agreeing, saying, when the lady said, why do you shave your heads? He didn't like those questions. Those useless questions, he considered them. If that's your question, it means you have no idea why you're here, why I'm here. He would answer like that. In the airport once, someone came up to us. It's Prabhupada sitting in the middle in the chair, Paramahamsa on one side, I'm on the other side. Somebody walked up and took right to Prabhupada, seeing him, senior most person, the Swami, said, why do you shave your head? Prabhupada looked, said, you answer. That was it. Wouldn't even say, he looked at Paramahamsa and said, you answer him. And then Paramahamsa answered. But in the interview with the camera, everything was there, U.S. television. We were famous. They thought there were millions of Hare Krishnas in the United States. There was maybe 1,000 all over the country. But they thought because we were everywhere, we were all over the place. We were so much because we were in the airports chanting and distributing books. We were on the streets, the center of town, 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, chanting the Mahamantra. You couldn't miss us, dressed like we were. So this was what Prabhupada did, and this is why he appreciated how we were dressed. Told you wasn't here, it was in Juhu. I walked into his room, a brahmachari. It was a little less orange, more on. We used to make our brahmachari color using 2 dyes in the US. We had Rit dyes, they were called. One was tangerine and the other was some pinkish thing. And together it became what we considered saffron color. And one day I walked into Prabhupada's room as a brahmachari. I had silk. First time I ever wore it. Devotee in England gave it to me, Jai Hari. He was flamboyant, very nice devotee. We became friends at the Bhaktivedanta Manor. He gave me a set of cloth. It's wonderful. No one ever had given me anything. So it was dhoti, kurta, sash. So coming to India, I would never wear it because I thought it was just too much. I remember with Dharmatma Prabhu, we went to an outing here some years ago. Somebody gave a dhoti, but it had a little border at the bottom. Oh, immediately Dharmatma gave it to me. I can't wear this. It's got a border on it. It's not brahmachari, can't wear such a thing. So that's how I felt with this silk, polished silk, not raw silk, polished, shiny. And then one day in India, when you run out of clothes, you haven't cleaned anything, you can't even find fresh water somewhere to wash something, I put the outfit on. It was after Prabhupada had taken rest. He rang the bell, and I went in. Just very innocently, I had it on, offered obeisances, and I got up. And his face, he looked at me, his eyes got all big. He said, "You look like you just came from Vaikuntha." It was so nice. But he liked that. He liked that we all look very nice for preaching purposes. This was it. We had to always balance these things, being very simple. Like he said, the Goswamis, they would sleep under a different tree every night. They didn't need any soft beds. They didn't care where they were sleeping. And then only 2 or 3 hours. But he said, for preaching purposes, we make so many adjustments. Prabhupada always looked first class. Always, when he would leave his room, he'd always have a garland. He'd get off the plane, he would make me go to the overhead. There were always garlands from when he left one city to go to the next. So there'd be 4 or 5 garlands. So he'd pick the one he liked. You didn't just hand him a garland. No, everything, he did it. When I massaged him, you massaged each part of his body until he told you to move to the next part. It wasn't just, everything was being directed by him. He was the master, the maestro. Every move, he wanted us directed. We didn't always. Sometimes we would be playing our instruments completely different tunes, out of tune. But his desire, he wanted us to do exactly as he was doing. So even the garland, he would say, that. So you take it, and then he'd say, now the others, you put your garland on. He would put his tilak on before he left the airplane, before he left his room. Always put fresh tilak on. Vaishnava. He presented the whole world, himself and all of us as Vaishnavas, to be Vaishnavas. So even by seeing us, think of Krishna. Anyway, I think we have to stop here. We'll continue tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Daiva Shakti. So tomorrow you'll be speaking. I think so too. Yeah, we'll do 2 hours long. Yeah, if that's okay with you, it's okay with me. Yeah, this is nice. Okay, all right. So, and I think tomorrow 5 o'clock maybe. I don't know. It'll be announced in the morning for sure. 6:30. 4:30 to 6:30 is good. Yes, we'll do the same thing tomorrow. Okay. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Jai.